About Sefiras HaOmer. Again, this is a digression from our main topic. And as everybody knows, the thing that you think about most with Sefiras HaOmer is all of the mourning customs. No music, no weddings, and the like. So it's important, maybe to make an obvious point, but it's important to underscore this. The Avelos Minhagim have nothing to do with the counting of the Omer. In other words, when the Torah says you count the days between Pesach and Shavuos, that is not intrinsically a sad occasion. It's really the opposite. The Sefer HaChinuch writes that this is actually a joyous period of time. It's the simcha of looking forward to Kabbalah Torah, meaning the Avelos is not inherent in the period of Sefiras HaOmer. And indeed, as far as Chazal are concerned, there is no mention, number one, in the Torah, and number two, even in the Gemara itself, there is no mention of observing mourning minhagim during Sefiras HaOmer. And note that I use the word minhagim because these did start off as minhagim. They are not chiyuvei deoraisa, and at least originally they were not even chiyuvei drabanan. Again, minhagim can morph into obligations because Klal Yisrael accepted them. But Me'ikar Hadin, we call these minhagei avelos. So where do they come from historically? So historically, they do not originate from the Gemara. They originate from the Gaonim, meaning the minhagim of avelos during Sefira started after the period of the Gemara, in the time of the Gaonim. But the Gaonim established these minhagim based on the story that is in the Gemara. So the story is in the Gemara, but not the minhagim of avelos. And this is the tragic death of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. The story of Rabbi Akiva generally is a very beautiful story, but it had this very tragic ending. Rabbi Akiva, I'm sure most of you know the Maisa, was an Amoretz. He was an ignorant person. He didn't know Torah at all. We're not even sure if he was fully Shomer Mitzvos in that earlier stage of his life. We're not entirely clear. But he became a shepherd for a very wealthy landowner in Yerushalayim. This is after the Churban. And this wealthy landowner, his nickname at least, we actually don't know his real name, his nickname was Kokhba Savua. Kokhba Savua is Aramaic for a satiated dog, a dog that is filled, can't eat anymore. If any of you have dogs, you know there's no such thing as a dog not being able to eat anymore. And the Gemara says he was given this nickname because he was so hospitable that even if a dog would have been his guest, the dog would have walked out full. So he was very generous, very hospitable. You may recall the Gemara in Gittin that we learn on Tisha B'Av about the Churban, that he was alive before the Churban, and he actually was one of the wealthy people that could have kept Yerushalayim alive during the Roman siege, had not the zealots burnt all of the storehouses and everything else. So Kokhba Savua was a charitable person, was on some level a righteous person, although we don't know a lot about other aspects of his life. His daughter had a daughter, Rachel, and Rachel somehow fell in love or was attracted to the ignorant shepherd, Akiva. She saw in him a certain greatness, a certain koach, and she wanted to marry him. Kokhba Savua was so angry, so incensed. Imagine, you're such a chush of a person, and your daughter wants to marry a poor, ignorant Amoretz, that he told her that if she marries this Amoretz, he will disinherit her, he will make a neder, that all of his property is forbidden to her. She married him. Kokhba Savua made a neder that all of his property is forbidden. So she lived in poverty. The Gemara discusses, the Gemara gives examples, that she would sleep with Rabbi Akiva in a barn, and he would take the straw out of her hair, etc. Even though her father was, multimillionaire or whatever the equivalent would have been at that time. And then we know the story that she encouraged Rabbi Akiva to go to Yerushalayim and to learn Torah, and he went and he started with the first graders in Cheder to learn how to read. He didn't know how to read, and he stayed there for 12 years. And by that point, he was a learned person. He was not yet the Rabbi Akiva. And he came back to pay her a visit. and he overheard a neighbor making fun of her, saying, what type of husband do you have who leaves you for 12 years and never comes back, doesn't come back? And she said to the neighbor, for learning Torah, I wouldn't mind if he would go for another 12 years. Rabbi Akiva overheard this conversation before he went in. He turned right around and he went back for another 12 years. Now, this is the part of the story that's, I think, maybe the most hard for us to understand. I mean, couldn't say hello, couldn't have a cup of coffee. What's the pshat that he just turned around? So, I'll give you two explanations. I think both of them are difficult from our vantage point to understand. But explanation number one, they say b'shem Rav Aaron Kotler, that there is a concept of a critical mass, meaning to say 1 times 24 is not the same as 2 times 12. Even in learning. Learning 2 hours straight is not the same as an hour, a break, and an hour. Because as the hours accumulate, there's a certain critical mass in which the individual units are greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of the individual units. Now, granted, the fact that Rabbi Akiva just paid a visit is already a bit of an interruption, but he thought if he had the opportunity to go back, he didn't want to make the hefsek so big. He wanted there to be a greater continuity in his learning. The Chazon Ish gave a famous mashal about this generally, although he was not talking about the Rabbi Akiva story. The Chazon Ish said, let's imagine you have a big pot of water that you want to bring to a boil, and it takes 30 minutes for the pot of water to come to a boil. Every 29 and a half minutes, you shut the fire down, let the pot cool off, and then turn it on again. Now, you could go 10 times. You could have it on for a total of 10 hours. But because you never had 30 continuous minutes, it's not going to boil. 29 and a half, 29 and a half, 29 and a half, 29 and a half. It's not going to boil. You need 30 continuous minutes. So the Chazon Ish says that when we learn, we should try to keep our time, straight without too many interruptions, because you don't make up 2 hours fully by learning 1 hour and learning 1 hour, because there's something about the critical mass effect. So Memela, Rav Aaron Kotler used to say that Rabbi Akiva wanted to have a hemshech of 24 years rather than 12 years. Of course, let me hasten to add that even al pi halacha, a person is permitted to do such an extreme measure only because if that's what his wife really, really wants him to do. If you were to impose this on your own wife, so take a lesson here, it would be absolutely usher for you to do that. This is what she wanted. Now, the other pshat, they say, in Rabbi Akiva, I think is actually very beautiful from a human standpoint, and that is, Rabbi Akiva knew if he would have stopped for a cup of coffee, or whatever they drank in those days, and he would have seen her pain, her suffering, her poverty, he wouldn't have been able to go back. It would have overpowered him. He could not allow himself to give in to the human emotion of the moment. It would have been too overwhelming. Once again, only because this is what his wife really wanted, but Rabbi Akiva himself would have broken down. And therefore he needed to not connect in that way. Okay. So 12 more years passed. And after those 12 years, a total of 24 years, Rabbi Akiva is now the greatest teacher of Klal Yisrael, the greatest teacher of Klal Yisrael. And he comes back with 24,000 Talmidim. Can you imagine 24,000 Talmidim? The largest yeshiva in the world. It's machlokas. Is it Mir or Lakewood? Okay, I think Mir probably wins out a little bit. So what is Mir? Actually, it reminds me a little bit of a Brisker joke. Somebody once stopped. I guess they didn't know. They were talking to Rav Yeshua, one of the Rosh Yeshivas of Brisk, but they asked Rav Yeshua in Mei Yesharim, "Can you direct me to the Mir Yeshiva?" He just like Stavia. So Rav Yeshua said, "Just stand still, and the Mir Yeshiva will come to you. They'll just build another building or whatever it is." So what is Mir? How many people are in Mir? Mir has a few branches in Brockfeld and the like. So Mir is between 8,000 and 9,000 students. That's big, big. Again, it doesn't compare to UCLA or some of the secular universities with their 30,000 or their 50,000, but for a yeshiva, it's pretty big, just like for Svarim, right? What's a bestseller? If a Sefer sells 2,000 copies, that is a bestseller. Now, that doesn't compare with John Grisham, right? All right, so Ein Chinami, it happens to be true that the market for Kedusha is a much smaller market, but still, 9,000 is, or 8,000, 9,000 is ganz good, biggest yeshiva in the world. Rabbi Akiva, as an individual person, 24,000 students. Can you imagine this? So he comes with 24,000 students. He's the greatest rabbi of Am Yisrael. And this woman who is dressed in rags comes forward to try to reconnect him, his wife. And the Talmidim think she's a crazy woman or whatever it is. They don't let her through. And Rabbi Akiva utters the famous words, Shali v'shalachem, talking to his Talmidim. How did he talk to 24,000 people without a mic? I don't know exactly the logistics of how you communicated in those days. But he says, Shali v'shalachem, everything I've done, v'shalachem, everything you have, Shalah is only because of her. She gets credit for everything. Can you imagine, from a human perspective, her simcha, her joy, all the years of suffering, all the years of deprivation, all the years of loneliness, all the years of rejection. But she was zocha to see. It was all worth it. Look at what was created. Now, the Gemara has an interesting maisa. Kalba Savua did not know that this great rabbi was his son-in-law. He didn't recognize him. So, but he did regret all the years. He finally, after 24 years, I don't know why it took so long, after 24 years, he finally regretted making the neder, and he wanted to get Hataras Nedarim. So he was told that this great rabbi could matter his neder. Actually, Me'ikar Adin, that actually is true, although we don't do that today. Hataras Nedarim either requires a beis din of 3, or a yachid, an individual who is very, very expert in Hilchos Nedarim, can matir Nedarim b'yachidus. Theoretically, that halacha would apply even today, and although l'chayra you would figure, Rav Chaim Kanevsky, Rav Elyashiv, you would figure we would have a category called Yochid Mumcha even today. L'maisa, that's not our minhag. We don't matir Nedarim b'Yochid Mumcha. We have to have a beis din. But nevertheless, in the time of the Gemara, they did. In fact, it's interesting, when did they stop doing it? So Kalba Savua goes over to Rabbi Akiva wanting Hataras Nedarim. Now, in order for there to be Hataras Nedarim, you have to give a basis that had I known a certain thing, I wouldn't have made the neder. And therefore the neder is released because you made it under a mistake. That is called a Pesach. Pesach means an opening. So, Kalba Savua says, I regret making the neder, I want to be released from the neder, and you're a Yochid Mumcha, Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva asked him, if you would have known that your son-in-law would become a Talmid Chacham, would you have made the vow under those circumstances? So Kalba Savua said, if I would have known he would know how to read, I wouldn't have made the vow. So Rabbi Akiva said, the vow is mutter. You have a Pesach, the vow is mutter, then he revealed himself, etc., and then everything was b'shalom. Now, Taisvus asks a very interesting kasha on that story. The Mishnah says in Maseches Nedarim, and if this makes a lot of sense, Ein poschin b'nolad. You cannot use as a Pesach for a vow a future event. Because the whole idea of a Pesach is you made the vow under a mistake. You didn't know a certain thing at the time. So if, for example, Rabbi Akiva was in fact a learned person, but from modesty, whatever, he was portraying himself as an Amoritz, and Kalba Savua made a vow because he thought he was an Amoritz. And then we could say, well, if you would have known he was a Talmid Chacham, would you have made the vow? That's a bona fide Pesach. That is what a Pesach is. what we call a pre-existing condition. But here there was no mistake. At the time Kalba Savua made the neder, Rabbi Akiva was an Amoritz. Elamai, things changed later. That's called a nolad. Nolad is a future event. A future event cannot be the basis of a Pesach. So how could Rabbi Akiva matir the neder of Kalba Savua because he became a Talmid Chacham? L'chayra, that's a nolad. Taisus asked the kasha. And the Mishnah says in Maseches Nedorim, Ein poschin b'nolad. So here's what Tosfos says, and this is actually a Musar vort that we could think about. It says, Rabbi Akiva had already started to either learn or commit himself to learning when the neder was made, although he was ignorant. But he had already made the decision. So says Tosfos, once a person commits himself to learning, it is so batuach that he will become a Talmid Chacham that it's not treated as a future event. It's treated like a done deal. It's treated like it already happened. And the Knech was because Rabbi Akiva already made the commitment. The Gemara tells us because he saw water go through a rock. Water was eating through the rock, and he said, if water can penetrate a rock, the Torah that's compared to water can certainly penetrate the obtuseness, the rock of my intelligence, or whatever it is. So this is an amazing thing, right? You commit yourself to learning. You stay with that commitment. Your success is going to be batuach. Of course, this is what Chazal say elsewhere. If a person says, Yogati, Gemara in Megillah, I have worked in the Torah, v'lo matzasi, and I was not successful, al tamin. We don't believe him because there's only two possibilities. Either he didn't work, or he was successful and maybe he doesn't realize it. But to say I worked and I was unsuccessful, that's impossible. One part of that statement is incorrect, factually. Either you didn't work or you're successful. But I worked and I'm not successful. That's not shy. Now, of course, success has different levels. I understand that. If a person says, I worked and I'm not the Vilna Gaon, okay, that I can believe. I can believe somebody who tells me that. But success isn't necessarily measured by the highest possible madrega that a human being can achieve. Okay. So that's a beautiful thing. The idea of that this is not called a nolad. This is not called a nolad. Now, so far, very, very sad story over time, but it ends in triumph. It ends in success. It ends in something very, very, very beautiful. But unfortunately, that is not the end of the story. Within a few years after Rabbi Akiva returned, those 24,000 students died. They died. And they died in the period between Pesach and Shavuos. They died. Now, how did they die, let's say? Then we'll talk about why they died. How did they die? So this is an interesting little machlokas. I mean, the Gemara itself says they died through a plague, through some type of disease, some type of illness. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to say something sometimes, for whatever reason, some people get very, very upset whenever this thought is said. They call it apikorsis. It's not apikorsis at all, but I'll tell you why they call it apikorsis, because it's connected to a certain source. We know that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. But around 60 years later, or 65 years later, 135, we have the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was the second attempt of the Jewish people to get independence from the Romans. Right, the head of that revolt was a man whose name was Shimon ben Kuziva, but Rabbi Akiva himself believed that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach, and that's why he called him Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, because Mashiach is described as a Kochav. And Rabbi Akiva actually felt Bar Kokhba was Mashiach. Shimon ben Kuziva was Mashiach. A colleague of Rabbi Akiva, Yochanan ben Torta, disagreed with him. He said to him, Akiva, first name basis, grass will grow on your hand before Mashiach will come, meaning you'll be long dead before Mashiach comes. Bar Kokhba initially had tremendous success. Bar Kokhba recaptured from the Romans, or liberated from the Romans, around 900 villages. I mean, little villages, but quite a lot of success. And there is even archaeological evidence that under the psak of Rabbi Akiva, they began constructing a third Beis HaMikdash. There are remnants of a third Beis HaMikdash on the Temple Mount. Archaeologists were able to date it at all. But eventually we were not Zeicha, and eventually Hadrian, retaliated with overwhelming force, and on the 9th of Av, this is 65 years after the Churban, the 9th of Av, 135, the 9th of Av, there was the great massacre in Beitar, which is another tragedy of Tisha B'Av, in which, well, the numbers the Gemara gives numbers in the millions that were killed. All right, so most Rishonim say, or most Mefarshim say, exaggeration, but certainly hundreds of thousands were murdered. The casualties were much greater in the aftermath of Beitar than even the Churban Beis HaMikdash. And even the Ruchnius consequences were worse. Losing the Beis HaMikdash is, of course, an unbelievable calamity. But the thing is, even after the Churban, we were allowed to do mitzvos. We could teach Torah, we could daven, we could keep... Right? The gezeros of the Romans against keeping mitzvos is not the aftermath of Tisha B'Av, of the Churban. It's the aftermath of Beitar. Jews were not allowed to live in Yerushalayim. It got renamed Aelia Capitolina, a temple to Jupiter. So in many, many ways, Beitar was even more devastating than the Churban, Beis HaMikdash itself. How do we understand Rabbi Akiva? That's a very complicated question. Did Rabbi Akiva make this monumental mistake? Because if you think about it, if you just analyzed it politically, this was a very, 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 very serious mistake. Yeah, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, but Yidden were allowed to live in Yerushalayim. They were allowed to learn Torah. They were allowed to keep mitzvahs. Rabbi Akiva backs this Bar Kokhba revolt, and the Romans retaliate, in which hundreds of thousands are murdered, and mitzvos, right? In fact, that's why Rabbi Akiva was eventually tortured, because he wasn't allowed to teach Torah, and he was teaching Torah. So, did Rabbi Akiva back the wrong horse? I mean, did Rabbi Akiva make this monumental error, like pushing the nuclear, the atomic bomb button and setting off? So it's a little complicated. We don't know for sure, but the pashtus would be that Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach, meaning to say, in every generation, there is potentially someone that is Mashiach, but the generation has to be worthy of it. So Rabbi Akiva did identify the right person, and had Klal Yisrael been Zeicha, that would have been the Geula Shlema. Elamai, we were not Zeicha, so all of these consequences happened, so somebody else would become Mashiach, as it were. So it's not that Rabbi Akiva was wrong, chas v'shalom. We don't have the right to say that. But the idea was that the door was not zeicha at that time. So all of this is well known. But here is the theory that many people get upset about. Some have suggested that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died. They were killed by the Romans because they enlisted. They based on Rabbi Akiva's own hadracha, they fought the Romans in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and they were the casualties of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, I'm not sure why. Maybe it's connected to the draft today. I'm not sure why this observation, which is an interesting observation, sometimes elicits violent reactions. So I just want to warn you: do not say this at your Friday night host's house, because I cannot guarantee what their reactions are. But the reactions are sometimes surprisingly violent. I want to tell you why. First of all, they taina, well, what do you mean? The Gemara says they died because of a plague, how can you say they died because of their participation in the Bar Kokhba revolt? So the truth of the matter is, Rav Henkin, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, who was a great gadol, contemporary of Rav Moshe, a little older contemporary of Rav Moshe, but mamish a gadol and one of the great poskim in the 20th century, actually affirms this idea that the Talmidei Rebbe Akiva died because of their participation in Bar Kokhba revolt, and he said the fact that the Gemara calls it a plague is simply consistent with many places in Shas where the Gemara is very obscure or hints at the Bar Kokhba revolt. It really does not discuss the revolt biarichos, because it would be dangerous for Jews to talk about the revolt against the Romans, etc. It might be seen as an incitement to revolt, etc. So Rav Henkin said he didn't have a problem with the notion that certain inyanim in the Gemara are stated in remiza. They are stated by indirect allusion. Okay, so with the fact that the Gemara does not say it beferish doesn't negate it. All right. So why do people get angry? They might not even know why they get angry. They might say, "Well, my Rebbe got angry," and the reason is because this theory was first articulated in the 19th century by a Rav Rappaport, who was the Rav of Prague, and Rav Rappaport was a Talmid Chacham, and he was a Shomer Mitzvahs. But he was very involved in Haskalah. He was a maskal, meaning he was involved in secular wisdom, secular knowledge, etc. And among the more Haredi segments of Eastern Europe, Rav Rappaport was always very, very suspect. He was a suspicious character. And therefore there became almost an instinctive reaction that anything he came up with has to be treif because he's a maskal. Now again, he was a Shomer Mitzvahs for sure, no question about it. And by the way, he had a very, very illustrious father-in-law who was the furthest you could imagine from Haskalah, and this was none other than the Ketsos HaChoshen, the classic Ketsos HaChoshen, Avnei Miluim, one of the most yeshivish svarim ever written, that is most makubal in the world of the yeshivas. That was the father-in-law of Rav Rappaport. But Rav Rappaport, as I say, he was the Rav of Prague, but he had modernist tendencies. And he was the one who developed this theory, this speculation, that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva were participants in the Bar Kokhba revolt. And I think it somehow got embedded in the yeshivish world that this is a treif idea, even though most people won't know why it's treif, but it's because of its origin in the writings of Rav Rappaport. He was known as Shiur. Shiur is like, I think, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport. Shiur is the abbreviation that he used. Okay. Be it as it may, for our purposes, it really doesn't make much of a difference. 24,000 students died. Maybe a plague, maybe Bar Kokhba revolt. They died. Can you imagine the tragedy to Klal Yisrael? Can you imagine the tragedy to Rabbi Akiva? Can you imagine the tragedy to his wife? She suffered all these years. She finally saw success, and everything is taken away. So the more important question than how did they die, right? Okay, that's a machlokas, let's say, is why did they die? And here the Gemara says the reason they died is because they did not show proper kavod. They did not show proper honor, proper respect, zealous. They were taken away from the world because they did not show respect to each other. They looked down at each other. They weren't machshav each other. And therefore, this is why the Gaonim say later. So again, the Gemara, remember, be sure you understand what the Gemara says and what the Gemara doesn't say. The Gemara does not say, therefore, we have mourning during Sefira. No, the Gemara just gives you the story. The Gaonim said that this is our makor, that during the Omer period, we mourn for the students of Rabbi Akiva, and we refrain from, at least for part of the time, we'll talk about that so the next time, we refrain from marriage and haircuts and shaving and the like. Now, it's very important. People ask the question, okay, every single year, after more than 1,500 years, I mourn the students of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, 24,000 people dying is a tragedy. Of course it's a tragedy. But, I mean, listen, since then we've had crusades. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were wiped out. Khmelnytsky massacres, the Cossacks in the Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Jews. And then we have the Holocaust, 6 million Jews. So we dedicate whatever it is, 33 days, or even some people even do 7 weeks of mourning because of the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, when we've had tragedies that are so much worse than the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. Why do we harp on the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva? So there are two answers to this. You can't just measure this in numbers. You have to know that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva were virtually the entire transmitters of Torah to the next generation. If they're all gone, then Klal Yisrael didn't just lose 24,000 people. Klal Yisrael lost the Iker Mesorah of Torah Shebaal Peh. Even in the Holocaust, that wasn't the case. Yeah, in the Holocaust, we lost so many Gedolim and Tzaddikim, but we had Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael, we had Gedolim in America, Moshe Feinstein, etc. But this would have lost everything. Torah was hanging by a thread. The Gemara goes on that Rabbi Akiva had 5 Talmidim. He started again with 5. And the whole Torah came down to us from those 5 Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. So the tragedy is not just numbers. The tragedy is that the Kiyum HaTorah was mamish. B'sakana. But there's another reason that's important, and that is, we had the Crusades, and we had the Holocaust. But we don't have Nevi'im and we don't have Chachamim. So if I were to ask you, why did the Holocaust happen? All right, so people can give speculations. Rabbi Miller wrote a book. But we don't know. But with the death of Rabbi Akiva, we do know. Chazal tell us they didn't show proper kavod. So the reason we focus on Talmidei Rabbi Akiva is not just to mourn, but to rectify, to fix the reasons. In other words, you understand the difference. With the Holocaust, I can mourn and grieve, but I don't know exactly what it is I'm supposed to fix. I can guess, I can imagine. With Rabbi Akiva, we have an exact reason. And therefore, the Avelos of Sefira is not about Avelos. The Avelos of Sefira is about rectification and tikkun. That we have to learn how to have kavod for each other, to be machshav each other, and that's connected to Avas Yisrael.
So the Second Bar Kokhba War was more than 6 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, right? And then Rabbi Akiva, he was a famous Talmid Chacham during both events, right? Even though it was such a long time apart. Right?
No, so he was not. That's what I'm saying. Rabbi Akiva was not a Talmid Chacham at the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Only by the Bar Kokhba revolt he was a famous. So the 24 years is shortly before the Bar Kokhba revolt.
But don't we know also from the Gemara that Rabbi Akiva was the one who laughed when the temple was destroyed?
Well, no, you have to be careful. It doesn't say he laughed when the temple was destroyed. He was walking by a temple that was destroyed, but it was destroyed 50 years before. In other words, it's like you're walking by the HaRav today. So it doesn't say he was laughing at the time of the Churban. He was walking by, and the HaRav was in a state of desolation, and he saw shualim, foxes, going out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So that is, yeah.
Why is the Sefer HaChinuch described as a happy time? The Gemara says that.
No, because what he's saying is that, remember, the Sefer HaChinuch is explaining the mitzvah of Sefiras HaOmer. So this is the ambiguity that we're facing. It's kind of a double thing. Mitzad, the mitzvah of Sefiras HaOmer, which is a countdown or a count up to Matan Torah, that's Simcha. There are other things for which we have Avelos. So it's a complicated idea that this is both a time of Simcha and a time of Avelos for the Talmidei Rabbi Akiva. Okay, but remember that indeed the Minhagei Avelos originated from the Gaonim, and we'll talk next time, and that's why there's all sorts of machloksim as to which days do you have Avelos, Ashkenazim, Sfardim, many different Minhagim, and also what is included in Avelos, what is included in the Avelos restrictions. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Can I change my minhag from one year to another year? Can I go to a wedding that's during my Sefira period and not during the Chassan and Kala's Sefira period? Of course, now, by the way, now you're in the period, this is the blackout zone. This period right now, there is no minhag that allows it, meaning before Rosh Chodesh, there are different periods of leniency after Lag BaOmer and before Rosh Chodesh, but this is the period L'chula Yalma. So don't get married this week, no matter what. So we'll talk about those minhagim. But again, as I say, the point I'm making is that the Avelos for Talmidei Rabbi Akiva is about tikkun. It is not about just mourning. Because if it would be mourning, as I say, the Holocaust was, l'tzarenu, we have worse things than this. But the difference is that this is the one that Chazal gave us a definitive reason. A definitive reason. Everything else we don't have definitive reasons, so we don't know what to be mitaken. Here we have a concrete thing to be misaken. Now the question we have to think about, again we'll carry this over to next week, is, okay, not showing kavod, not a nice thing. Do you deserve to die for that? Is that a chiyuv misa? You get wiped out because you didn't. Not showing proper kavod. We assume that they weren't like pushing each other. They weren't calling each other idiots. I mean, they weren't doing things that were really, really, really bad. These are the students of Rabbi Akiva. Elamai, they didn't have the proper kavod. You're chayav misa? That's a pretty amazing thing. Right, so Mr. Shem, we'll talk about that next week.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.